keenly aware that I'm the only thing standing between this room and a cocktail. So we're going to go ahead and keep it light, keep it easy. Nice little pre-cocktail conversation here in this beautiful liminal space halfway between the, let's call it the hopes of Las Vegas and the dreams of Hollywood. For my talk, Place Your Bets, the possibilities and probabilities of a lower resolution future. So to kick off this nice, light, easy talk, let's ask ourselves, is the internet dying? Well, let's put a pin in that, but we did hear from Ryan this morning, first thing, that half of the internet's traffic right now is being driven by bots, right? And we also know that this problem is being exacerbated by generative AI in the form of so-called zombie websites, where legacy publications, in this case Surfer magazine, which has very high domain authority with Google, has been hollowed out and now hosts a bunch of low-quality Gen AI content that nevertheless ranks very highly because of that high domain authority. And then, of course, you have made-for-arbitrage or made-for-advertising websites, or so-called intentionally zombie websites, right? Like, they did this on purpose. These are websites that are just meant to serve you ads. Ads for major brands, right? Like LensCrafters. And one of the big challenges with these kinds of websites is that they present big brand safety issues, right? If you're LensCrafters, where don't you want your eye exam ad? Probably not next to a juvenile clickbait headline about quote-unquote crazy eyes. This is not good for anyone. And of course, these ads are served up programmatically, which is supposed to be advantageous to big brands because it helps you get cheap reach, right? But the challenge is that these programmatic black box algorithms serve up these ads on these made-for-arbitrage websites, and regrettably, they just soak the brand's budget because you're serving up the same ad thousands of times per second to an army of bots, and you're draining your budget, which goes on impressions. So, as we heard from Ben today also, a lot of the signals that marketers are using to go ahead and build a high-resolution, really detailed view of their consumers and customers and clients are going away. And that's going to be a challenge for organizations who relied on this. It's also a challenge emotionally to our own sense of control, isn't it? We're used to having that granular data. We're used to having that high-resolution view. How could anything lower resolution be helpful at all? And so the challenge is that this is making the internet a worse place for people to be. It's creating a user-hostile internet. And even worse for the brands is that they're the ones who are paying for it, right? So, pretty dire stuff, right? Wouldn't you know it? Just as I slide right into middle age, the world is going to hell around me. What are the odds? What a coincidence. Well, allow me to offer a more positive and countervailing view. I do think it's easy for us to mistake a higher resolution view for a better one, but that isn't necessarily the case. And to prove I'm not all doom and gloom, who said that? Me. Like my countryman George Bernard Shaw, I like to quote myself from time to time to spice up the conversation. So what do I mean when I say a higher resolution view isn't necessarily a better one? Well, let's go ahead and talk about resolution. I'm old enough now where I've seen media formats change half a dozen times, growing up with Betamax, VHS, Laserdisc. Anyone here have a Laserdisc? And then, of course, your DVDs, your Blu-rays now streaming. And at each one of these upscales in resolution, whenever movies made the switch, there was a predictable outcry about people complaining that artifacts got upscaled, and it was making a higher resolution image, but it was a worse user experience. The latest controversy, of course, involves AI being used to upscale these movies. Specifically, director James Cameron, director of the Terminator franchise, recently applied this to all of his movies, and everyone from critics to guys who make podcasts that are longer than those movies themselves agrees it's a higher resolution image, but it's a worse user experience. On a more serious note, high resolution images don't necessarily lead to better outcomes in more serious cases where life and death is at stake. Medical imaging diagnosis has gotten so good that we can now zoom in on pathologies that may or may not turn into problems, and it's leading to overdiagnosis. And some of this is being exacerbated by applying AI algorithms to this. Unless you think this is an edge case, there are popular consumer companies like Prenuvo and Ezra that are going to be rolling out some MRI clinics nationwide for you to just go in and pay to get a full body scan. And this isn't necessarily going to go ahead and lead to improved health outcomes. This is stacking problems on top of problems because, as we heard earlier today from Kat, everyone is suffering from overwhelm. Everyone is suffering from information overload. We have all the info we need. We have a high enough resolution image of what the problem is and the potential actions, but it doesn't actually help us make decisions, right? We reach a certain saturation point, and past that threshold, our ability to make strong decisions degrades rapidly. It's not just people who suffer from this too, it's businesses. This is a report from Gartner recently that showed that 4 out of 10 employees feel completely overwhelmed by the information they get at work. Now, those employees, only 6% say that they are highly likely to stay with that company, which is a big problem, of course, for employee experience. Also, among all this information overload, it leads to a sort of a false confidence in the numbers that we're looking at, right? Those of you who were here at the assembly last year may remember this slide. It's maybe the one of 2 slides I'm going to show from last year. But this is basically 2 data sets. One provided by Google Analytics, their attribution model showing the contribution of search to sales. Hey, look, I showed you an ad, and everyone bought. 28%, 39%. But when you zoom out and actually bring in other kinds of context, as Grace Kite, an econometrician who runs a great shop called Magic Numbers, did, what she found was it wasn't 28%, it was more like 6%. It wasn't 39%, it was 10%. There were things like, the weather or the price or other contextual lower resolution things that contributed to those numbers. So this false confidence in numbers is sometimes leading us into some silly places. Now, this is where I have to confess that unfortunately there was a part of my presentation that is not going to happen. This was supposed to be the only presentation today presented in Sense-Around with actual French fries to be served during this time. So just please imagine yourselves snacking on delicious McDonald's fries. I think what happened was McDonald's canceled my order because they said, "You want this many fries?" No, this is a prank. So, does anyone know what this billboard is? This is one of several billboards that was put up about 6 weeks ago, about 8 weeks ago now, in the Netherlands. McDonald's red, and if you walk past it, it smells of French fries. Just a fun little thing. But like lots of fun things, the internet had lots of criticism for it. I've I've concealed the identity of the strategist, who's very smart and who I like, who I follow about this kind of stuff. But just to read it for the folks in the back. Many seem to love this smelly campaign, but I think it smells like a scam. McDonald's just created a billboard that smells like French fries. Can somebody tell me, what business KPI is this driving? Who is it targeting? How expensive it was to make versus ROI? Honestly, in my opinion, this is a piece of work to win an award. Boo! Boo awards. But let's take them seriously, right? Because these are the questions that we often have to answer for ourselves, and they're worth considering seriously. But before we do that, it's the end of the day. Do we have to be scientists about everything, right? This is a fun little billboard, right? Can't we just go ahead and make a judgment call every once in a while? Can't we place, as Zach was just talking about, a small asymmetric bet that might fail, but that also might have giant upside? Let's go ahead and dig in. What business KPI is this driving? This is going to sound like a joke, but it's fame. And that sounds really, really simple, but fame is actually a really good measure of success. As a matter of fact, if you go back to Binet and Field and the research that they've done 10 years ago and has been reconfirmed in the time since, fame-driving campaigns outperform on all these business metrics. Sales, market share, profit, loyalty, price sensitivity. We're going to come back to that in a second. So can we go ahead and say that fame is a low-resolution, high-probability success measure? And if that doesn't sound scientific enough for you, well, no less an authority than the Ehrenberg Bass Institute, basically the founders of marketing science, use fame as one of the 2 axes on their measurement grid for measuring distinctive brand assets. If I take a yellow arch and I describe it to you, that's a pretty distinctive brand asset, right? You can kind of figure out how unique that is and how famous it is. We hope, of course, that the assembly, this distinctive brand asset, I believe our water bottles don't have the assembly written on them. Can you confirm? I think, Pete, have you got it? Oh, it does? Oh, okay, so forgive me. But it also has our other distinctive brand as it's not just the name, right? So I mentioned that part about price sensitivity. Again, this sounds really simple and obvious, but people pay more for brands that are famous and popular. Again, you don't need to go ahead and do it in econometric analysis of this. Sometimes being famous is enough. So who is it targeting? I don't know. Like, does anyone here not like French fries? Let me ask you this. Do you have to build a persona for different kinds of fry guys? Like, if do we improve our strategy at all if I group Bill and Mike Jarrett into fry dads, right? Jamie, are you and Kat, are you chip moms? Do we need to go ahead and have like a different campaign for you? Probably not. No, it's probably good enough to go ahead and say, try to reach everyone in your market, right? Reach, again, produces really good business effects. This is not a super complicated thing. Reach, much like fame, is a low resolution, high probability success measure. How expensive is it to make versus the ROI we get? I don't know. I don't know what their budget was. I'm just being honest about that. But maybe we can treat a small portion of our business activity as a bet. And some bets are going to lose, and some are going to have asymmetric upside. But ROI is not the be-all and end-all. Those of you who have been in charge of marketing budgets know the best way to goose your ROI, because it's just a ratio, is cut your budget a little bit. But the problem is then you also cut reach, and you also cut fame, and probably harm those business effects, right? Anyway, this was a massive success, at least on those two measures, fame and reach. It made big headlines. It appeared in everything from Fast Company and Business Insider to Food and Wine. There's one other thing I forgot to mention, which is that all of these billboards were placed within 650 feet of McDonald's. So there was a strategy to it. It wasn't just, you're going to smell fries and then nothing is going to happen. Eventually, hopefully a few months from now, they're going to be able to go ahead and show whether or not these things actually had an effect, whether there was an ROI, whether there was any sort of impact from this business-wise, and who knows. It might even be enough to, horror of horrors, win them an award. So here's where I don't have anything as cool as Jen's Slido polls, but maybe just a quick show of hands, which I had imagined during this time would be busy eating French fries. But did anyone here not know that people like popular things? Okay. Is anyone shocked that you should sell to the whole market? Anyone who could be a customer? No? Okay, good. Did anyone not know that people like fries in particular? And I know that these things seem thuddingly obvious, but that's kind of my point. We have gotten to the place where we have subordinated a lot of common sense and our own judgment to data, into flowchart thinking. What I mean by this is a simple and deterministic view of the world, where I show you an ad and I claim 39% credit for your sales. But the world is not like that. The world is a lot more dynamic and reactive than that, right? We act, the world reacts. The odds reset. We need to go ahead and devise another strategy. Khalif talked about this earlier today with reactive strategy, right? This is what it is. And I want to highlight a contradiction I've just hopefully stumbled across here, which is I've just used a bunch of data to tell you that you shouldn't really listen too much to data. All right, guilty as charged. But I want to plead for a more nuanced case there, which is the balance between data and judgment, between not necessarily needing to have a number to back up every single call that you make, that human judgment is in fact the irreplaceable part of all of this. And there's a growing realization, at least in marketing, that it's really probably better to be roughly right than precisely wrong. And if there's only one thing that you remember from this talk, it would be this. Aggregate data in the form of things like reach and fame, in the things like case studies that people have talked about today, in the form of heuristics like Khalif has talked about today, can provide you with a low resolution but highly actionable view that better fits the reality of the world that we actually live in. So, how do we get to that lower resolution view? What happens if we leave the safety blanket of high resolution data behind and start subtracting? Some people have already started doing this. The Pew Research Center is getting rid of their demographic reporting on generational cohorts. What that means is if you were like me 15 years ago and entered marketing, everything was millennials. They're so different. Oh my gosh. They're so different. And now it's Gen Z. These kids aren't like anything you've seen before, right? But here's the challenge, is as Pew has collected more data over the years, when you zoom out, what they find is that there really aren't big attitudinal differences between generations. What there are attitudinal differences between people at different phases of their life. When you're young, you tend to care more about student loan forgiveness. When you're old, you tend to care more about Social Security solvency, right? So because of that, they're going to go ahead and stop doing generational analysis unless they have historical data that can let them compare those generations at later stages of life. This is where the wisdom of something that Kalev talked about this morning in the three-body problem comes back around. That human unchanging nature, that is in fact the thing to go ahead and keep your eye on. Google, whose mission is to organize and make useful the world's information. I've had the good fortune, along with a few other people in this room, to work with them on a few projects. One of the things that they mentioned to Ryan, one of the last interactions they had was they've solved their own information overwhelm by trying to fit everything on a Post-it note in a meeting, forcing people to boil down the core information they have to share, the core strategy they have, to just the bare essentials, Post-its over notebooks. Because while that sounds like a lot of effort, it's also a ton of effort to go ahead and hunt for the needle in the haystack of the increasingly higher resolution images that we have. This is a lot of effort. So what would happen if we took some of the effort out of this? What would happen if we relaxed into the problem? What if we let our vision sort of blur, let our eyes relax, and we look at the world in a lower resolution way? I'll tell you who wishes they would have done that. Tropicana, circa 2009. If anyone knows this story. In 2009, Tropicana hired Peter Arnell and the Arnell Group to do their rebrand. They spent millions of dollars on the rebrand. You can see here that when you think about that grid, that axis of fame and uniqueness, pretty distinctive brand assets there, right? You got that nice, recognizable orange with the red and white striped barbershop pole, that nice old-fashioned font. Sure, it's a little dated. Arnell Group modernized it, did really, really well. Really made the design modern and sleek, showing the product for the first time, right? Tropicana lost about $30 million in sales in about 7 weeks. They were the blur test. This is from a book called Eat Your Greens, a paper called The Science of Effectiveness. Essentially, the blur test is how people see things in their peripheral vision. And when you're dealing with information overload, when you have too many milks to choose from, you're going through the grocery store looking for the one with the orange and the straw in it. You don't see it, you grab something else. We think that people think about our brands a lot, but that's just not true. We're increasingly realizing that people maybe don't want to have conversations or relationships with brands in the way that we originally thought they did 10, 15 years ago, like on social media. Instead, we have to recognize, as we tell people at One North all the time, tell our clients, you have to have a market orientation on these things. We think about our organizations for 50, 60 hours a week. Our consumer doesn't. To them, we're really blurry. And that's why we have to make strong choices and make strong bets. So, what does that mean to have a more probabilistic understanding and place those bets? I think first we have to understand what game we're playing. We talked about that simple, static, deterministic view of the world where you show somebody an ad and I claim credit for sales. That's just not true. That's a game of pinball. We have to understand the odds that we're facing. We have to understand the other players at the table. We have to understand that we're actually playing poker and that the odds reset with each and every hand. And we need a strategy for that. Do you need to stalk your audience? We heard today from Ben about what happens with that, right? Declining survey responses. People don't necessarily want to have those conversations. But maybe you can find a small group of great brand loyalists, and you can just go ahead and talk to them, right? Do you need that granular data for every single decision? Or can you rely on things like, in marketing, fame and reach? Can you rely on probabilistic case studies? Can you rely on heuristics? To do that, you have to really make a strong judgment about what is probable, not just what's possible. This sort of possibility cone here shows, dead center in the bullseye, what's the projected future? What's plausible? What's possible? It might happen. And then what's probably outside the possibility cone? Again, you're going to use data to do some of this. You're going to use technology to do some of this. But the irreplaceable, vital ingredient is your own judgment. So again, I'm not telling anyone to not use data or tech. You have to strike a balance, right? And sometimes that balance is going to feel pretty effortful, and sometimes it's going to be a little more complicated. But I think getting this balance right is really important. I think the stakes are actually pretty high. It's not just about whether or not there's going to be a more user-hostile internet or a friendlier internet. I think when we consider the role of privacy and consumer protections, especially in the last decade, I don't know if anyone's read this book, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, but one of the things that the author talks about is how organizations everywhere have built incredibly granular, high-resolution images of us, not just demographics, but psychographics. And they use this to sort of try to place bets on our futures. How are we going to go ahead and behave? And some of those decisions that they've made with that data have not been to the best of human flourishing, right? So if you look at what happened with Cambridge Analytica or with Facebook's experiment here, I would argue that the stakes are nothing less than our civic fabric and maybe even our emotional lives. High stakes. Now that's not to say that tech or data is inherently totalitarian. I think that, looking at Ryan's image from this morning, I think Apple's even walked this back a little bit, right? It's not malicious, they're just detached. But the problem with being detached is that you can still stumble down a road that really nobody wants to go to, right? So it turns out by happenstance that all of us had like architectural drawings for this. I didn't really even realize this. Does anyone know what this is? I'll give you a hint from Jessica's talk. Circles imply constraints. This is a 250-year-old architectural drawing from the philosopher Jeremy Bentham, who invented utilitarianism, or at least was a leading proponent of the idea. This circular building has rooms in the perimeter that face toward an open center, where a single column in the center provides a full view into every single room. So if you're standing in the center, you can see everything. But if you're in one of the rooms, you can't really see anything. He called it the panopticon. It is a perfect image of high resolution and total visibility. It is a perfect mechanism for control. It is a prison. This is the Presidio Modelo. They built the panopticon 200 years later in Cuba. This is where Fidel Castro and his brother Raul were imprisoned in the 40s and 50s. It is now a museum. You can go and see it. It is something that we could unwittingly find ourselves drifting toward. But I don't think we're going to do that. I think we're going to make stronger choices. I think that some of the bets we're making are going to pay off in a much better and more human way. But to do that, we need to make some realizations. We have to figure out, first off, that when we wait and see what the data says, the data doesn't say anything. The data is never going to speak. It will not decide for you. In the end, the terrific freedom is yours. It actually is up to you. So what does that mean practically? Well, it means from time to time, what did Ryan say this morning, to use the force? Turn off your targeting computer every once in a while. Trust your own judgment. Note that he didn't jump out of the X-wing. Data, technology, it's still the vehicle. It's still the thing that gets us there. We're totally committed to that. But we need to go ahead and strike that balance. And as for the fate of the internet, the nice thing is that there's some green shoots happening. Ask Jen Lill more about that verified content thing. There's other things like that happening in the social media space. Has anyone here heard of Mastodon or the Fediverse? Smaller, organic social networks that can connect and federate organically. Has anyone here heard of Marginalia? This is maybe my favorite thing on the internet that I found this year. Marginalia is a new search engine. It's lower resolution than Google. It doesn't have all the fancy bells and whistles. What it is really good at is finding small, old, and obscure websites around crafty things, around topics. And not only is it low res, but it's also probabilistic. That rainbow button near the search bar, that is random. If you hit that, it will go ahead and show you an array of potential websites, old, weird, cool things that you might be interested in. And the idea here is that if we can rewild the internet, well, what is chaos but just another word for wilderness? We can make it more wild again. We can make it a place to explore. We can make it a place to improvise. We can make it a place to look toward a more human future and place our own best bets on how to get there. Thank you.